Hi, the reading today is Acts 27, verses 1 to 26, Paul sails from Rome. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius and belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Atrium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Astricus, Macedonian from Theolosia, was with us. The next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius, in kindness for Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Seleucia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Adrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Carusius. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, followed the advice of the pilot, of the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter, in the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. There was a harbour in Crete facing both southwest and northwest, the storm. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Claudia, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of the Cyrus. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the shore the next day, they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. As they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island."
That was a challenging one, wasn't it? Goodness me. Very long and lots of long words in there. Well done. Very good. Thank you. I'm really glad that Pete prayed that God would give me the freedom to do whatever God put on my heart, because I feel like today God's asked me to do something different, a little bit different to what I normally do, and that is sort of part talk and part testimony. Now, in my head, it all works and makes sense and ties together, so I just really hope that it does when it comes out of my mouth to you. So I've been an avid reader ever since I can remember. I've always loved books. When I was a child, I'd have friends round to play, and my mum would find my sister playing with my friends, and I'd be up on my bed reading my book. So as you can see, from a very early age, I loved stories. But the stories I've always liked best are the ones that have everything tied up at the end. You know, whether it's a book or a film, I like to have all the loose ends tied up, you know, nice and neatly, to know what's happening, and, you know, or to not have any of these sort of open-ended endings that, you know, you don't know what's going to happen next. But Acts, it's a funny book because it sort of ends quite suddenly. This is the second from last chapter, but it is quite a sudden end. And you think, goodness me, what's, you know, this, it feels like it's finished partway through the story. So up until this point, we've had lots of good talks on different bits of Acts, haven't we? And you know, this is the narrative of the early church. It's a story of how the church started and was established in those early years. You know, the apostles went around, didn't they, preaching, establishing churches, doing miracles, lots of people becoming Christians. Very exciting times. But I have to admit that I find the ending a little bit frustrating. So, we come to Paul. He has travelled around. He's done lots of miles, and of course, travel back then was very difficult, very, very slow, very different from now. But he travelled around a lot of the known world at that point, preaching the gospel. Loads of people became Christians through his ministry. Churches were established all over the place because of what he did. So, you know, he's just a pretty amazing person, isn't he? So, at some point, though, earlier than this chapter, God had told Paul that he needed to go to testify in Rome to Caesar. Now, Caesar at that point was the Emperor Nero, so he's not a man who was known for liking Christians very much. He was more likely to, you know, torture and kill them. So wanting to go to Rome to speak to Nero, it was almost literally wanting to walk into the lion's den. You know, that was a real possibility for him. But he was absolutely convinced that this is what God wanted him to do. You know, he'd been told by God really clearly that this was the thing. Now, he, in his mind, also had a clear idea of how that would happen. Because actually, it's not anybody can just go and, you know, rock up and talk to an emperor. You know, there has to be a process of getting there. And so he very deliberately went to Jerusalem, where he knew that if he preached, he was going to be arrested. Now, his friends at the time, you know, they saw all the good work that he was doing. They thought this was a really bad idea. They tried to persuade him not to go. But he knew that was where he had to go. So off he went to Jerusalem. He preached, and of course, he was arrested. And so the story of Paul's time in prison in Jerusalem is quite long. It went over quite a long period of time, and he went backwards and forwards to different people hearing his case. And he got a little bit fed up in the end, and he said to them, "I appeal to Caesar." Now, this is where, you know, God had planned things. Even before Paul was born, he'd planned this journey for him. Because Paul, although he was a Jew, he was born a Roman citizen. And that meant that if he wasn't happy with the justice he was getting, he had the right to appeal to Caesar and to get his case heard by Caesar. So that's what he did. And, you know, even then, there were obstacles along the way. Some of the Jews, you know, did a plot to try and kill him, but his nephew happened to be where these people were talking overheard, so that was foiled. So it was really quite miraculous that Paul got to this position where he's just about to go on this boat off to see Caesar. So again, his friends didn't really understand, but Paul was absolutely convinced that was God's will for him. And so it's unlikely that many of us will go on quite such a dramatic journey as Paul did. I mean, some people like Raph have come on a very long journey to serve God. But I think, our lives are a bit like a journey. Wherever God's taking us, he orders our steps, doesn't it? Lots of verses in the Bible talk about this. In Proverbs 16:9, it says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." So this is where I switch into a testimony, and this is a testimony. This part of the testimony, a lot of you may have heard before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I sort of need to do this in order to make the rest make sense. But Paul and I felt very strongly that when we came to Wales, God was bringing us on a journey. I grew up in Reading, he grew up in Devon. We lived most of our married life in the Midlands of England. But my family were from Wales, from Barry. And my childhood holidays were spent here. My weekends, whatever, visiting family. So South Wales was always my home. It was always my place of Cynefin, the place where I felt like I belonged, even though I didn't grow up here. But I married an Englishman, so I thought the chances of getting to Wales other than holidays was pretty remote. But as our kids grew older, we used to come down to Cardiff from the Midlands, and me and the kids used to go to the rugby match. Paul would drop us near the stadium. He's not a massive rugby fan, so he'd go exploring, and he absolutely fell in love with the area as well. So that was brilliant. And so we had this idea that one day maybe we would move to Wales when we retired. And at this point, we were looking to move house. Our kids were, Rian just there, was just about to, she's our youngest, she was just about to go off to university. So we were looking to sort of move to the nearer where we both worked. I worked for an international mission organisation, but near Birmingham, based near Birmingham. Paul worked not far from there. So we were looking, but things weren't falling into place. We were looking around and nothing felt quite right. And at the same time, where I worked, we didn't really do much in Wales, and we were talking about how we could reach more into Wales. And every time we talked about it as a leadership team, I just felt this overwhelming sense of hierarchy that I need to be there, And so Paul and I were talking, and now this is my memory of how it happened, which his memory is slightly different, but, I remember him saying, "What if Wales isn't the future? What if Wales is now?" But it didn't make sense. We were working in the Midlands. It just didn't make sense. But he was really convinced by it, and I wanted to be convinced by it, but I didn't know whether it was what I wanted or whether it was really God, So he was away with work. I was walking to church one Sunday, and I remember praying, "God, if you want us in Wales, you are going to have to make it crystal clear to us." And I got into church, and there was a visiting person leading the service. She got up and she said, "Come to Wales." Those were the first words out of her mouth. And I think, well, okay, God, I think perhaps that was an answer to prayer. And so from there, it was miraculous, that what happened from that point. Paul's got a very specialist job. He's a noise and vibration consultant or specialist. So there's not a lot of, it's the Midlands where you have industry and things. That's where you have that sort of job. You don't have that sort of job in South Wales much, really. So he was prepared to change jobs, change career, take a pay cut in order for us to move here. We put a house on the market. It sold within hours for the full asking price. As we found the house we wanted, and it's even little things like in my books that I read as a child, I used to read about something called the Cherry Tree Farm, which is an Enid Blyton book. I always wanted to live in a farmhouse, and when we put an offer on our house, I realised the house we just bought is a farmhouse, So there were so many things that God was in, just even little things that I wouldn't have even thought of. Paul got this job in Cardiff, which he was in his specialism, and he didn't have to take a pay cut. He got more money. So there was just all and within 2 months of putting the house on the market, Paul had got a new job, and we were here in Caerphilly. So it was really, really amazing. So that sounds like a sort of a happy ending, isn't it? A happy ever after. Like all the loose ends are tied up, everything's working out. Hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that in a short while. So Paul is on his way now to Rome. And it's quite a long, convoluted journey, isn't it? I mean, when we went to Rome a few years ago, it was off to Gatwick and then a quick hop over on the plane, although the journey to Gatwick was not brilliant. But, so this was a long, long journey, several boats, very slow boats. The weather played a big part. And as we read in the chapter there, there was a bad decision by the people sailing the boats. So what would happen is, if they wanted to transport soldiers, prisoners like Paul, the soldiers would book a berth on a cargo ship. So really, they had to sort of go along with what the captain of that ship wanted to do. And unwisely, the people on this ship decided they were going to sail, in spite of Paul's warnings about it. And I think, in our lives as well, sometimes some of the difficult things we go through are not of our making, are they? They're of other people, daft decisions as well. And I don't believe that God made this bad thing happen to Paul, but I know that God knew that it was going to happen, and he had it in his plan. He made his plans to bring something special out of what happens to Paul. And the journey, that storm, would have been absolutely horrific. If you can imagine, the waves would have been crashing right over the boat. Completely dark, no electric lights, but even you wouldn't be able to really have a candle or a lamp because of the danger, because you've been, pushed around as the boat was going up and down. And this went on not just for a few hours or a day, this went on for possibly even a couple of weeks. I mean, they must have been absolutely terrified, mustn't they? I mean, it must have just been the most horrendous experience, and they obviously never thought they were going to come through this at all. And it was, just awful. And they were shipwrecked. Again, must have been a very frightening experience. But what happened was they were shipwrecked on a little island called Malta, which I'd like to go to. I've never been, but it's supposed to be really nice. Lots of people go there on holiday now. But he was shipwrecked on Malta. And so Paul, being Paul, he starts to heal people and do miracles and preach the gospel. And people on that island, because they had to stay there for a few months whilst the winter passed and the weather got better, another ship came along. And during those few months, he preached the gospel. And, people became Christians. And because of that, there have been Christians on that island for over 2,000 years. Now, the legacy that awful experience that Paul had to go through and the opportunity he took from it, the impact of that, we can only, even knowing that 2,000 years of Christianity on that island was a result of that, I mean, that's just scratching the surface of the impact that Paul made through that awful, awful situation. So I think going back to the testimony part of this, you'd think after the miraculous way that God brought us to Wales, as I said, that would be happy ever after, everything's plain sailing, all things would be going well. But that wasn't what happened next. The period after that was one of the most difficult in my life. It was a real dark storm of a period. I had been through some really difficult things with the organisation that I worked. Some people I trusted believed and said things about me that weren't true. I felt betrayed. There was a lot of things that really had a really negative impact on me. I was burnt out. I was just not in I had a break. Basically, I had a breakdown. And I was able just about to put on a face of looking normal. I mean, Kath knows because she was there, on the outside. But inside, my mental health I was just a wreck, really. I was in bits. My physical health wasn't good. It was just one of the most awful times that I've ever been through. And it took me a long time, actually, to recover that, years, I would say. But one of the things that kept me going through that dark storm was the fact that God must have he couldn't have done all that he did to bring us to Wales for it to be no reason. So I hung on to that throughout that time. I think also what got me through was my lovely husband over there who never stopped believing in me. And people at the church here, we'd only been here for, it wasn't much more than a couple of months. And I would not have come through it without the loving family here. And it was strange, because I think throughout that time, what I started to realise was that I had been working more in my strength than God's strength. I'd been relying on myself more than God's leading up to this time. And I'd let my identity become, and my confidence and become wrapped up in the role that I had in the mission organisation rather than being rooted in God. So throughout that time, as difficult it was, God did so much in me to build my roots into the right things so that my identity was in him, that he was the only one I cared about what he thought about me. And he built a sort of a strength and resilience in me that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And gradually I got to a place where I felt able to think about, because at one point I never thought I'd be able to do a responsible job ever again. And I got to a point where I thought, I could do something. And I started to ask God what it was he wanted me to do. And I said to him, look, God, I don't mind what I do. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'd quite like it if that involved somehow doing something to build up the church in Wales, sort of training or something like that. And I'd quite like it to be in Cardiff for no other reason than I just like Cardiff. But I was genuinely willing to do whatever whatever it was that God wanted me to do. I don't think I've ever been in quite that place before, where I stood before God like that, just giving him everything. What I didn't know at the time, because I hadn't been in Wales long enough, was that the Anglican Church was actually called the Church in Wales, because in England it's the Church of England, isn't it? So my prayer, I'd like to do something to build up the church in Wales. God obviously took me very literally, because along came a role in an almost brand new Anglican theological college, training people in ministry, training ministers and things like that. So it was literally what I had prayed for. And it has been such a privilege, to be part of other people's journey as they've trained, as they come closer to God, learn more about God. And it's stretched me beyond what I could have ever imagined, but it's great. Does that mean that's my happy ending and a happy ever after and all the loose ends are tied up? No, it doesn't actually, because it's a bit unsettled at the moment because the principal's just about to move on. Life is never straightforward, is it? Things like health things come up, or oh dear, or family situations. There are things that come up. So that's not my final ever happy ending either. And, I think inside I still feel quite young. And I feel like I've got lots of chapters left to lead. I have no idea what those chapters will look like, what they will say. So we don't know what happened at the end of Acts. We know that after Malta, Paul got on a boat and got safely to Rome. We know that for a couple of years, he preached to all and sundry. Everybody that came and saw him got the gospel. So we know that he made the most of every moment of that time. Early church historians think that he probably was acquitted, and then there's evidence that there was another journey after that before he was finally martyred, but we don't know for sure. We don't even really know what happened when he spoke to Nero. It obviously didn't have much impact on Nero himself because he carried on doing awful things to the Christians. And it's a long time ago, so it's difficult to do exactly the cause and effect of Paul's ministry back then. But the Roman Empire obviously went across pretty much the whole of the known world in that day. And what we do know from other historical accounts is that the army that went and conquered and then set up, outposts like the one down the road in Calais and places like that, they also had to have lots of trading people, with bringing along food and all the other things that the armies needed to survive, who also did quite a trade with local people as well. And it is the traders' wives who are thought to have brought Christianity to Wales. So the traders' wives who probably became Christians through people like Paul or people that he'd preached to and they'd become Christians, who actually brought Christianity to Wales. So we can trace our faith now back to what happened directly then, which I think is quite amazing. And this is just an extra snippet, just it's not really to do with the story. But when the Romans withdrew from the Britain, much of Britain went back to paganism. In Wales, we experienced a bit of a revival, and St David was one of the key figures in that, and they had monks going off, up from Wales to evangelize other bits of the world as well. But that's just a nice little extra story. So I think Acts stops where it is because it's actually not a full book. It's one chapter. It's the first chapter in the story of the church. And that story is still happening. And actually, each one of our journeys, whether it's a long journey like Raf or whether it's just God's taking you to the place, when I say just, it's a big thing, to the place where you work or your neighbours, your sub-story is part of that big story, and your sub-story or subplot is an important part of the big story, and it's all those subplots that bring together to make that big story of the church, which isn't yet finished. But we do know what the end is, and the words of the song we're going to sing next say this, that I don't know what he's doing now. Somebody mentioned what's going on in the world at the moment. I look around and I think, oh my goodness, it's a complete mess what's happening in the world at the moment. But we do know how the story ends, because one day God will come, Jesus will come back, his kingdom will be established, and all that sorrow and pain will disappear. So that's the end of the story. But in the meantime, another line in that song says, I don't know what he's doing, but I know what he's done. And I think that, to me, that every time I sing that line, it really hits me, because actually I don't know what he's doing in the world at the moment. I don't know what he's going to be doing next in the next chapter of my story or your story. But I know what he's done. I know what he's done in the Bible. I know what he's done in my life. I know that whatever I've been through, he has been faithful. I know that he died for me. I know that he loves me. And those things will never, never change. So that is really what I felt God wanted me to say to you today. And just that each one of you, your story matters to God and is important to God. And no matter what storm you go through, God can take that situation. I don't think he makes all those storms happen, but he will make good things. He can make good things come out of every single one of them. And even if you feel you go off the rails and maybe you think, or maybe I haven't followed the path that God has set for me, it's a bit like a sat-nav. I hope God doesn't mind me referring to it as a sat-nav. But you go slightly off and the sat-nav reroutes you. And that's what God does with us. Sometimes perhaps we don't go quite where he wants, or it goes. But he always, if we are listening to him, he will always bring us back onto the path. It might be a slightly different way or a slightly longer way, but he'll always bring us back to where he wants us and lead us where he wants us to go.